James Stavridis to join me, retired United States Navy, former head of Southern Command, former head of European Command, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and sometimes the stars align, Admiral. The news is that General Austin is the new Secretary of Defense designate from the President-elect, and you are contemporaries. You must know him well.
I do know him well. I worked with Lloyd over 20 years ago in the Pentagon when I was a relatively young Navy captain. He was the Army equivalent, a colonel. He was in the Directorate for Operations, very prestigious job. I was over in the Directorate for Strategy and Policy. So we've known each other for at least 2 decades. And I think he's a good choice. He's obviously has an unimpeachable combat record. He's a Silver Star recipient, fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan, commanded at every significant level, was a 4-star in charge of all of our troops in Iraq at one point. So great operational combat experience. But here's another important part about being Secretary of Defense, Hugh, and you know this. He knows the building. He knows the Pentagon. He's been the Vice Chief Staff of the Army, the Director of the Joint Staff, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot to many observers. I would say the most important 3-star job in the armed forces. He oversees the entire joint staff and kind of pulls all that advice together for the chairman, the SecDef, and the president. He's had that job. As I mentioned, Directorate of Operations. So he's got great Pentagon building Washington experience alongside very strong combat experience. And then lastly, personally, he's calm, he's steady. I think he is what the Pentagon needs at the moment after 4 different secretaries of defense in the last 4 years.
Now, Admiral, let's run through the objections that have been raised. The first is that a waiver will be needed. A waiver was secured for General Mattis. I doubt very much that one will be denied General Austin. But why does that law exist, and what do you think about a second successive waiver in a second successive administration?
Yeah, it is the right question to raise. There ought to be a robust discussion of it, and I think there will be during Lloyd's confirmation hearings. And the reason it exists is because we, as Americans, we want civilian control of the military. So obviously, our president is a civilian. We like that our Secretary of Defense is a civilian. It's actually happened twice. You mentioned Jim Mattis, as I'm sure you know, Hugh. Early on, we saw George Marshall become Secretary of Defense in a relatively brief period of time after coming out of the military. So the law exists to make sure that we don't just recycle old admirals and generals into these civilian leadership spots. But again, when I look at where we are right now with 4 SecDefs in 4 years under President Trump, I think bringing someone into the job who really knows the military, has lived it, and he retired, I think, 4 years ago. So that's a pretty good fire break. I think the law requires 7 years, close enough, in my view, and I think he will get through.
So, Admiral, this raises the second question. He's a contemporary of General Milley, who's chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and probably was, if I've got my timing down, because General Milley was recalled to take that job, probably was served under General Milley at some point. Is there any problem with putting a former, if I'm correct about that, a former subordinate on the top of the chain? Does that create any kind of weird situation?
I think your chronology might be slightly off. Maybe we should both check. But my recollection is that Lloyd is a 1975 graduate of West Point. And I believe General Milley, who went to Princeton, by the way, did not commission until probably 70 to 80. So I would be very surprised if we discovered that Lloyd had served under Milley. I think rather the opposite. My guess is that Lloyd knows Milley well. Milley has probably worked for Lloyd at some point, or they have certainly
Well,
been
then that would be much more natural.
Yeah, indeed. So I don't see that as a problem. Now, I will say this, with my tongue slightly in cheek, as a Navy admiral, I kind of say, We got a Secretary of Defense who's a West Point graduate and an Army guy through and through, and we have a Chairman of the Joint Chiefs who happens to be a Princeton graduate but is an Army guy through and through. Maybe I hope my beloved Navy doesn't get disadvantaged. I say that again with my tongue in cheek, knowing both Lloyd and Mark Milley. And by the way, Mark Milley has spoken fairly recently, as I'm sure you saw, about the need to build our Navy. But there won't be any problem with that. Both of them are joint officers who have served in joint commands. Lloyd's last command, of course, was combatant commander of U.S. Central Command, where he commanded Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, just like I did in Europe and in U.S. Southern Command. He's a joint officer. He'll treat the Navy just fine.
Well, in fact, I was good. That's my last question. My major question is that I did get questions from my friends in the Navy. Oh, there goes the rebuild of the Navy. We've got another Army guy. General Milley did give the speech at Brookings where he said we've got, basically it was a telegraph to the Army that you're going to lose your third, one third, one third. It's going to go down and the Navy's going to go up. But to me, I immediately thought, well, Nixon to China. General Mattis came in from the sea services and did not reallocate money in favor of the Navy, kept the allocation pretty much as it was. Maybe it takes an Army duo to actually reallocate the pie significantly to the sea services. Any merit to that, Admiral?
I like the way you're thinking, and I suspect it'll be actually less about Nixon goes to China and more about we are all worried about China. In other words, and you know this well, if we're going to create real military deterrence against China, we're not going to do it with a large standing army because we're not going to fight a land war in Asia, as the saying goes. But we are going to need a robust Navy and long-range Air Force assets if we're going to deter China. So I think both Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley get that. And alongside most current defense analysts, I think we're going to see a reasonable plus up to the Navy because of the realities of China.
Now, Admiral, I don't take a backseat in my admiration to anyone when it comes to General Mattis. But as I said to him when I interviewed him at the Nixon Library, the critique of his time was that he stood up Central Command as his staff. It was just everybody who had served Jim Mattis as Central Command came and took up staff jobs at the Pentagon, jobs typically held by civilians, and that was disruptive to the normal operation of the building. Do you think General Austin will be going out and finding his old chief of staff, his old second in command, and bringing them in to the Pentagon with him?
My guess is, and it's purely a guess, I haven't discussed this with Lloyd, is that he will know that the best course of action for him is to come in as a civilian leader and surround himself with people who are strong on their own merits, whether he has worked with them before or not. And let's face it, he will need help in a couple of areas. One is procurement and acquisition. That's not a specialty defense. He can bring some of those assets. He'll need some help on Asia. He does not have a strong background in Asia. And as we were just discussing, that'll be critical for the new Secretary of Defense. And he's going to want to create a sense of some stability in the Pentagon. Now, as you well know, all transitions are horse trading opportunities where those who have supported the campaign want to come and be the Secretary of the Air Force or the Secretary of the Navy. And General Austin will get some picks. I should say Secretary Designate Austin will get some picks. And the transition team will get some picks, and the Democratic Party will get some picks. So it'll be a mix. And I'll close with this. Every secretary should bring one or two people that he or she is really comfortable with and has worked around in the past. But broadly speaking, my guess and my hope is that Secretary Designate Austin will start to bring in outside players that maybe he doesn't know well, but who can help him in some of the areas we just discussed.
Now, when former Secretary Gates was a guest on this program after his most recent book, and I asked him about his comments about President-elect Biden being wrong about everything for 40 years, he said, well, look, I'm also worried about his tension with the generals, that he didn't get along with the brass at the Pentagon. I was encouraged to see he had actually been at a either a change of command or the retirement ceremony of Lloyd Austin. That he knows him, knows the Secretary of Defense. We're not going to have a McNamara Johnson situation here. How important is it? This is a civilian's question, but I mean, how important is it that the SecDef and the president like each other?
It's very helpful. I've seen examples kind of going both ways, both in the Secretary of Defense level and at the Secretary of the Navy level. Sometimes the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations get along extremely well, and sometimes there's real collision there. Same thing at that higher level with the SecDef and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So it's helpful but not necessary. And government politics is the art of resolving differences and allocating resources. So I'm quite confident, knowing Lloyd Austin, that he'll get along very well with the military, and maybe more importantly, Hugh, he'll get along very well with the national security team around President-elect Biden. And he knows them. He's worked with them. He is well acquainted with every one of them, as am I, from our mutual time together. He'll be, as we talked about with the Biden National Security Team, there's no one on that team that I see who's trying to be the MVP of the team. It's a group that are going to try to make each other look good on the court, try to work together well, no drama, very collegial. I think Lloyd Austin fits that mold.
What about the question that there's a very controversial decision when he was CENTCOM commander to withdraw immediately from Iraq? I've already said on the program this morning, I just wonder if you agree. He executed an order there. He is not responsible for the decision. Do you agree with that, Admiral?
100%. And I don't know what Lloyd's personal views were at that time, but he is the consummate professional. That was an order. I think it was a mistake, as do many of my contemporaries, particularly those who fought in those wars. And I think you can drop a plumb line from that decision to the rise of the Islamic State. You ought to get, when he becomes Secretary of Defense, Austin, on, ask him that question. It's a fair question.
One last question, which has to do with how they operate in comparison General Mattis. In terms of time in the building, he was Chief of Staff of the Army, he was CENTCOM. Who has more time in the building before becoming Secretary of Defense, General Mattis or General Austin?
I think roughly the same. And they both had critical but slightly different jobs. But their backgrounds are fairly similar. And I think that it's a pretty good bet that General Mattis would be someone who would say, yeah, Lloyd Austin, 2 thumbs up. You'd have to ask him. Hey, I got a last thought for you. It's a really important one. And it's that you asked about, the allocations for the Navy and all that. Here's what I'm worried about. Who are they going to cheer for in the Army-Navy game? And that is coming right up. And
Well, we know the answer to that, don't we, Admiral?
oh, and as an Annapolis graduate, all I had to say to Secretary-designate Lloyd Austin, my great friend, is go Navy, beat Army. Coming right up this weekend.
There you go, Admiral. Good to see you. Thank you. We're going to get some ReliefFactor.com sent up to the Army and the Navy. ReliefFactor.com.